Hugh, I've called you a legend of the Australian birdwatching scene. Is that a fair comment?
I don't think I'm a legend. After I'm dead, then I'm a legend, but then I won't know because I'll be dead.
For those who don't know, Professor Hugh Possingham from the University of Queensland, one of the lead counsellors from the, I think we can still say, newly convened Biodiversity Council here in Australia. And we're going to try and speak positively about conservation and biodiversity in Australia. I'd like to apologise, kia ora, to those of you in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm really sorry that the French, the organising and committee at the Olympics don't know you exist. You were left off the world map on the closing ceremony. Really sorry about that. We're always thinking about you and your amazingly cool birds here in Australia. Hugh, we corresponded several weeks ago and you were off doing some bird surveys. Just before we talk about the Biodiversity Council, where have you been?
I've been in my favourite bird watching part of the world. I'm not sure it's anybody else's favourite, but it's my favourite, which is the upper limestone coast of South Australia. It used to be called the upper southeast, but they rebranded themselves to make themselves a little bit more sexy. It's basically north of Narracourt and Kingston, south of Salt Creek, Keith and Bordertown. About 1 million hectares of fairly heavily cleared land, but with some significant conservation parks. Cassie Schwaber and I had organised to resurvey about 152 hectare sites that a person called David Baker Gabb. Have you actually interviewed David Baker Gabb, Grant?
I haven't, but
you should.
Just bringing him up means it needs to go on my whiteboard over here.
He really is a bird watching legend. David Baker Gabb has been prominent in the bird world for many years. And he surveyed these 150 sites in 2013. And to be honest, I've been going down that region for 40 years. One thing I like now doing a lot is doing something that somebody else did before. So he surveyed all these sites over about a month, both in the winter and the spring of 2013. We've just finished the winter survey, which is a little bit nippy at times. It's one of those few days when it's -2 and there's frost and you're pushing through the vegetation. You think, I really wish I had fingerless gloves, which I've never managed to organise for myself. And binoculars at -2 is not the most pleasant thing in the world. And counting birds, a lot of sites, we had some friends there with us, Charles, David Eady, Peter Copley, and we did the survey. We were also amazing. We had 8 days of bird watching with no rain.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
We had family friends who had a farm down outside of Mount Gambier at actually Onkaparinga. As a little kid, it's the last time I went there, I was early teens. And I used to go there as a little kid and I was so excited. Blue-winged parrot was my lifer down there. So how many neophemas did you get?
Blue wings, I've been bird watching in that region for 40 years and poured through all the vegetation map. My first job ever in my life was as an undergraduate. I made vegetation maps and bird surveys in 1981 and 82 of all the parks in the upper southeast. Yeah, blue wings are mainly on the western side and the southern. The northeastern bit of the southeast, they're around. We've probably had half a dozen. The occasional elegant, so you do have to check. And if they're flying over at 100 kilometres an hour, you're probably not going to be able to tell. But it is an interesting part of the world because in theory, if you go towards the coast, you could see all 4 neophemas rock orange-bellied. If they weren't orange-bellied, weren't down to just a few hundred or so. But yeah, no, neophemas are there. Their blue wings are now actually just being listed by the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, but they're not doing too badly in that part of the world.
I've actually seen blue-winged parrot here in St Albans in the west of Melbourne. Only once, saw a pair once, but they obviously passed through.
Yeah, they can deal with some disturbance of habitat stuff. So, they're the kind of things I think the landowners, if they keep a bit of rough grazing and stuff, they'll live in. They don't need pristine, intact vegetation.
Now, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping because we've got eyeballs on us on all the platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Instagram. Instagram, you're in a slightly different category. If you want to ask a question or raise something for me to bring up with you, be patient. I can get across to you. The folks on Twitch, Facebook, and YouTube who have been here before know it's pretty easy. Pop it in the comments and we'll address it. And I'm glad you're all here live. Hugh, let's talk about the Biodiversity Council. That is the main reason we're here. What was the catalyst to bring 11 of Australia's educational institutions and to draw on their funding sources to put together a pretty cool group of minds?
Yeah, I think credit where credit's due. It was largely driven by Brendan Wintle, Professor at the University of Melbourne. And I've worked, as many of us have, for many years with Brendan. Brendan is the master of it, and he had this idea, which we've always all shared, that biodiversity wasn't having a strong science-based voice. Clearly, the not-for-profits push biodiversity a lot. We also have 25 years ago, I thought biodiversity was at the top of the environmental agenda. And I say this without trying to be pejorative about it. In the last 20 years, so climate has been the environmental issue that has dominated the world. So if you talk to people about the environment, if I talk to people on my street, they think I'm talking about climate change. And the Climate Council has been amazingly successful ever since Tony Abbott fortuitously sacked them and Tim Flannery was the chair, if you remember that. This is the start you want, isn't it? You want somebody quite unpopular like Tony Abbott who doesn't like the environment sacking you, and then people like Leslie Hughes and others, they say, hey, this is ridiculous. The government doesn't care about climate change. We're making our own council. We want to be philanthropically funded. And I have to say, they have been extremely successful. Amanda and the team there, very professional, very successful at making sure climate is on everybody's agenda. But biodiversity, to an extent, not because of that, but just generally, I think has slipped off the agenda. And personally, and this is going to be extremely controversial, so you can edit this out in the full version, Grant, but bottom line is, most people don't like it when I say this, I think we're on top of climate change. I think we're not going to stop at 2, but we probably might wander out to 2.5 degrees and 3 degrees Celsius. It's not going to be pleasant. It's not going to be pleasant for many of the disadvantaged and poor people around the planet. A lot of people are going to die. But I think the world is now aligned on climate change, and almost every country in the world is working to stop it. And I would say by about 2070, 2080, the question will be, what temperature do you want? So we've gone up 2.5 degrees. How do we ameliorate this, and where are we going to go back to? Because I think our ability to harness renewable energy is now phenomenal, and we're going to solve that problem. Climate change will have a big impact on threatened species as well. Still in Australia, invasives and land clearing are still the biggest impact on threatened species. But if we lose half our species, Australia's losing a bird a decade, a subspecies or species a decade. If we lose half our species in the next 200 years, the recovery time is 1 million years. In fact, if you lose things like in a kidney, the recovery time is 0. But the diversity, the recovery of diversity takes hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. We can turn the climate clock back within 100 or 200 years, and we can stabilise the climate, because it's actually very simple. It's largely CO2 and methane, and we know the chemistry, we know the maths, we know the physics. As long as we don't cross a threshold that gives us runaway climate change, that would be seriously important. So I understand why the world's focused on it, but I reckon in a couple hundred years' time, or 100 years' time, people were saying, why did you wipe out half the species on the planet? Because we have no way of getting that back. That's done and dusted, and 100,000 generations of human beings are going to have to live with that loss. So really, Brendan and several of us said we need a voice that's just about biodiversity. We don't like climate change either, but we're focusing on the biodiversity issue. It's our sole focus, and it needs a voice in policy, it needs a voice in politics, and it needs to be a science-based voice as well. There are obviously many environmental NGOs have a strong voice in biodiversity, and they campaign and they work and they achieve many outcomes. This is an equivalent to the Climate Council, not seeking government funding. So it's, as you say, supported by those universities. Roughly they're funding about a third or 40% of it. The majority is philanthropic funding. So independent philanthropists and foundations like Potter Foundation are putting in the bulk of the money, along with the support of universities, particularly the University of Melbourne.
I don't want to stay on climate change for too long, but I think what people need to understand is that you cannot talk about biodiversity without talking about climate change. But you can talk about climate change and ignore biodiversity. And that's what I have always, in the last couple of years, been really clear to delineate what I'm talking about when I'm getting on a hobby horse. And I think you're agreeing with my approach in that the biodiversity retention, the biodiversity emergency is more serious, it's more urgent than climate change, because we can ameliorate the effects of climate change to some extent for humanity, but we cannot ameliorate it for all of the other species we share the earth with. So we have to address it with biodiversity being the number one concern. That's the way I see it. Because as you said, if we lose echidnas, they're never coming back. If we lose the orange-bellied parrot, we will get parrots. We won't get the same one, but we will get parrots, unless we wipe them all out. But we've won the awareness. The awareness conversation about climate change has been won. But
I agree.
But I don't think we're winning the awareness conversation on biodiversity. And that's because policymakers don't ever seem to want to talk about what the effect of the loss of biodiversity is. And
it seems a long time away. Climate change, we know, is affecting us now, but biodiversity losses is hard to quantify. There are some very good analyses showing 49% of Australia's GDP depends on biodiversity, but climate was a hard win anyway, wasn't it? Because it's a slow-moving thing. You can always kick it down the road. We did kick it down the road for 20 or 30 years. Biodiversity is operating at an even slower pace. The impacts on us, it's hard for people to act on things that don't directly affect them next year.
But there are two major countries and economies who, even though their populations understand and accept climate change, and the steps we need to take to rein it in. But Australia and the US are trying to talk about it domestically, but then ignoring it by being the largest exporters of energy per capita in the world.
You often get the argument, why should we do anything in Australia? Isn't this all about China and the United States? And I say that's ridiculous. Per capita, we are arguably one of the worst emitters in the world. In terms of export, we are per capita the worst emitters in the world. So yes, we should be, and given our prosperity, we have a very prosperous country. No, it's not prosperous for everybody, but we should be ahead of countries like Sweden and Germany and France, which are way ahead of us.
Let's talk a little bit about the makeup of the Biodiversity Council and their special skills, or their particular skills. Now, there's a couple of levels to the input, the makeup of the Climate Council. See, it dominates everything we talk about, doesn't it? The Biodiversity Council. Now, lead councillors, what's the role of a lead councillor compared to a councillor?
Not an enormous amount of difference. The two keys is Jack, who's a First Nations person. He and I are co-chairs of the Biodiversity Council. So I suppose we're turning up to a lot of meetings that the other lead councillors don't need to. The lead council is 12 people at the moment. It's half female, a third Indigenous, and that's roughly our targets across the whole council. And I suppose the lead councillor's role is to push agendas. To be frank, most academics, and what you're looking at often is a whole heap of people who are in universities doing teaching and research jobs, and anybody who's listening to this who is in a standard academic position would know their job has got a lot harder in the last 5 or 10 years. The average academic is working seemingly twice as hard. The complexity of the work is very difficult. So most people don't have huge amounts of time. So we really are driven by wonderful staff who are largely funded by philanthropy. The director is James Trezise. I suppose I won't go through them all, but we have just finally got a full complement of staff. We've got analysts, we've got fundraising, and Jana Dielenberg is our PR person. So they're the people I deal with a lot, and then we have a lot of people doing administration and analysis and policy pieces. So they're the engine room of what we do. The councillors are there to provide some academic advice and credibility to a lot of the things we do, and also to front up to things like Senate inquiries and have those critical meetings with politicians, other NGOs, and so forth. So full credit, I would say, and the success of the Biodiversity Council, which I don't want to pat myself on the back because I think my role was about 0.1%, is a lot to do with James and Jana, because we're already getting recognition across Australia of about 15% of people know we exist. It's for an organisation that's only existed for a year and a half. That's remarkable. We're not World Wildlife Fund yet. They've existed for slightly more than a year and a half. So we have a lot of media getting out there, and a lot of those people on the councillor page front that media, as do many of our councils. And in some senses, with 2 or 3 angles. One is, here's some really cool science relevant to biodiversity policy and management one of our councillors might have done. And many people will know people here on this list. Let's amplify that. So, for example, some of our work that the social scientists have done, so it's a very diverse crew in the councillors. Some of the social scientists have been around the attitude survey that they did. What do people in Australia think about biodiversity? This has been very influential research. And that attitude survey has found out that Liam led that attitude survey with other people, found that 80% of Australians want the government to spend more money on the environment. 80 to 90% of Australians want more. We know at the moment that we're spending federally about $500 million a year. Many of our publications and our research work has shown we need at least $5 billion a year. We need 10 times as much if you were serious about zero extinctions and stopping losing a bird a decade. You need $5 billion a year for on-ground work. Australians agree. 80 to 90% of Australians agree. We've done the analysis. We've written the papers. The peer-reviewed literature is out. There's no doubt about it. We can stop extinctions. Government says they're going to stop extinctions. We just don't spend enough money. And so we've been very forceful about putting that point repeatedly to federal and state governments.
Yeah. Now, I hear what they say, that if there's no dollars, I don't think we can take on face value as being fair income. Do you think that as we stand today, and with the last budget, no significant new effort to preserve biodiversity, do you think we can at this moment say, yeah, they mean it?
No, they don't mean it because they haven't done it. So there's a tiny increase, they would argue. It's very hard to actually work out how much Australia spends on the environment because governments' budgets are what is actual real biodiversity spending is very hard to determine. Maybe there's a tiny increase, but we're not nearly tenfold bigger. Of course, a lot of people will say to me, $5 billion a year, that's a lot of money. That's not even 1% of the federal budget. And those are, it's not even 1%. This is the environment. This is what sustains tourism, agriculture, our health. everything about the Australian way of life is the environment, and we're spending 1% of our budget on it. And yeah, we spend huge amounts on health, defence and all these other things. So it is remarkable. We're literally not even looking after the house we're living in. The house we're living in has holes in the roof. It's falling to pieces. The air conditioners are broken. The stove's broken, and we're just pretending we can ignore it.
And when people say, gee, that's a lot of money, they, meaning you and everyone else involved in science and conservation, why don't you fix it? When, if they compare it to the amount of money that just goes into building stadiums, refitting stadiums, and professional football codes, the numbers are dwarfed. And particularly when you look at the amount of people who need the environment, that's everybody. And the amount of people who need an AFL football team is a drop in the bucket compared. And we never have that conversation about why is the government spending this money on sport? Because sport's great because it makes kids get healthy, as all of our kids are getting fatter and more unwell.
Yeah, I think the environment's a better way to make people healthy, to be honest. As you would know, birdwatching, for example, is booming. The number of people who are engaged in birdwatching has probably doubled in the last few years. It might be to your credit, Grant, I don't know. But COVID pushed birdwatching up. We're now seeing probably the number of people who would say they were birdwatchers, I'm saying is now 5 to 8% of the population. Not as much as the United States, where it's 37% of Americans claim they're bird watchers, and a lot of people see birds and do all those things. But we're getting there, and this is a huge thing for just getting people out. The number of people, I go down to Oxley Common every couple of weeks. When I used to go down there 20 years ago, I'd see one bird watcher every second visit. Now I'm seeing 15 bird watchers. I'm getting annoyed. There's too many people bird watching my favourite bird watching spot. But we're talking about 200 or 300 visitors to Oxley Creek Common every week. A whole range of people, a lot of photographers now, a lot of people from overseas. Their first stop, they get to Brisbane, they look up eBird, they look up bird data, they say, oh, this is a hotspot. This has got 7,000 eBird lists. I'm going to go there and I'll find a striped honeyeater or whatever they want to find. Yeah, and I think the thing about bird watching, it gets you out into fresh air. There's some exercise, there's some thinking, there's some counting, there's a lot of mental activity. So it's a healthy activity. You're not going to break your knees and your hips unless you fall down a hole. So it's not like heavy contact sport, but particularly for older people, some people argue that's probably the best way to stave off dementia because you're doing so many things simultaneously.
I'll just stop now. I've just seen a comment come up on Instagram. Behaviour, culture, ecology. Maybe we need people from agriculture and tourism on the council.
Yeah, the councils are basically academics partly because there's two reasons. We want to be completely independent, and that's why we're funded from the universities and philanthropy, so individual donors. And that means we can say what we like. As soon as you take money from other sources, you can't. If you have too many people on the council that are working for a company, those people are restrained. They may have every of the best intentions, but heavily constrained. I agree that tourism and agriculture are potentially huge allies, particularly tourism, but I work with people in agricultural science. Yeah, but the tourism industry, half its money comes from biodiversity, and to be honest, unlike, say, the beef industry, which beef research and development gets a lot of money from the industry, grains research and development, fishery research and development, tourism industry money should be taxed to pay for biodiversity advocacy and science, because effectively advocacy and research, they're entirely very much dependent on the biodiversity of the country. I mean, the 320 bird species that are nowhere else in the world, all those Americans, that 100 million people who are bird watchers, they all desperately want to come and just see even a rainbow lorikeet would make them happy, let alone koalas and other things.
I was going to bring my rainbow lorikeet in for this conversation view that I still don't know if it's a he or an it. It's a bit noisy, but if you don't mind the noise, I might bring Loz in, and then anyone who's watching and has never seen a rainbow lorikeet, we might take an intermission in a moment. It'll take me a minute to get him. But I've been really enthused. I'm feeling really good about the growth of birdwatching, especially the birdwatching groups on Facebook, and thinking it's great to have all this participation. But it also shows me how little we know about the invasive species that are all around us. Have we dropped the ball on invasive species control? Like, have we given up on particularly birds like the common miner that are, taking away the hollows, which we're losing because of land clearing and fires at the same time?
Our CEO, James Trezise, comes from the Invasive Species Council, so the Biodiversity Council certainly advocate a lot that invasive species are still a major threat to biodiversity in Australia, and the best way to stop them, of course, is at the border. If they're here, it's usually a really big pain in the neck getting rid of them. You can see that from the fire ant debacle, where they appeared a couple of times and then finally they took off, and the governments, all the governments of Australia did not act fast enough, and now we've got something which we're going to be stuck with forever. Will actually reduce human amenity for parklands, but also pose serious threat to various aspects of biodiversity and all the other horrible ants like crazy yellow ants and stuff. I think it's a very important issue. I worry probably less about bird species invaders. I worry more about things like myrtle rust, wiping out a whole heap of chasing. I worry about cats. Biodiversity Council has had a lot of success on the cat stuff. And there's promising stories around cats. There's been eradications from islands like Macquarie and many other mammals, but they're really on board in places like Toowoomba Island. More and more people now are keeping their cats in their properties. And I think it's going to, we're not far away from treating cats like dogs, which should have happened 50 years ago. Cats should have been treated like dogs. That then reduces the supply of cats from the urban and peri-urban areas into the bush. Ultimately, of course, cats are on the continent forever. There is no solution to that, but keeping their numbers lower, which is a combination of animal control, but also maintaining healthy dingo populations in some places. It's going to be a big part of keeping cat numbers down, reintroducing native predators. Yeah, cats kill, something like 5 billion native animals, 6 billion native animals every year. So these are dramatic numbers, and they pick on, probably pick on reptiles more than they pick on birds, but they're a major threat to many of our birds. All the things that my favourite group of anything are the robins. They don't do well in cats. You can see that because there are not many robins sitting in people's suburban gardens anywhere in Australia.
And for those pedants out there, yes, we know Australian robins are not true robins. You gave me an opportunity to plug next Monday's guest, Hugh. I've got Elizabeth Bell, who is an experienced campaigner in island rehabilitation and removal of not only invasive predators, but also invasive plant species on islands. So I've been trying to get Biz for, I've got to say, years. She's one of the very first people I reached out to for the bird emergency. So we're talking back 4-5 years ago or something. Finally, Biz will be with me really early, 6:30 a.m. next Monday, because Biz is in New Zealand. Here, Naomi's all popped in the comments that she'd query your comment on danger while bird watching. She thinks it depends on where you're going looking. She dislocated her hip on Saturday.
Dear.
And got to watch the snakes. Obviously, you've got to be very careful where you go bird watching. Really sorry to hear that, Naomi. I hope your hip is no longer dislocated, but that can be very painful.
Tripping and falling is actually a remarkably common problem. And it's particularly problematic when you're looking up in the sky, and I've often fallen down a mysterious hole. It doesn't take much to do a hip and a knee.
And it's really easy to trip over a log
From
or even in the long grass where it gets tangled and you get your foot snagged and you can go forward. Especially if you're balancing binoculars and a camera and maybe even got a
notebook
on board.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you for a comment about what the New South Wales government had decided about offsets. You probably thought that in the last fortnight, Hugh. That, I think I'm being fair to say, they said offsets don't work. We know they don't work, and we know that they're not accurate, but we're going to keep using them.
Yeah.
How does the government get away with that? How do they come out with that comment, but be let off the hook by the media in general without having a policy to replace the one that doesn't work?
Yeah, I have sympathy with them, having been part of the review of their legislation a couple of times. And I was just at an offsets conference organised by the Environment Institute of Australia and New Zealand 3 weeks ago in Canberra, where we went for 3 days, just talked about offset. Possibly could have been the one of those. Actually, people find offsets fascinating.
Another show about that.
Offsets, we could.
I'd love to do that if you're available.
Very happy to go into the details of offsets, but to avoid going into the maths and the equations, because actually it was Megan Evans, Martine Marin and I who created the federal government biodiversity offset calculator about 10 years ago that's now used. New South Wales probably has some of the best offset stuff and because they actually pay a heavy price for the offsets. The trick is this: offsets, you are destroying something and you're promising to pay nature back. And there's many things then. So I want to clear this place for a new hospital, fine. Or I need to put inland rail. Inland rail is going to create a lot of offsets, state and federal level. And sometimes it's going to be very hard to go around. So the first thing about offsets is you should not go through that native vegetation or that last known habitat of that particular orchid species. You should avoid it. But if you can't avoid it, minimise it and mitigate it. But then finally, yes, you can see inland rail is going to go through some vegetation that's important for a variety of species. So it is the last resort. And in some cases, it's going to be unavoidable. The trick is you take from nature, you destroy 15 hectares of high-quality native vegetation, putting in a road or a hospital. You promise to pay it back, but the trouble is so many things can go wrong. Many of the things you've destroyed don't get paid back very quickly, like a hollow for a powerful owl. That is not going to be paid back in 10 years' time, let alone even just a tree. The understory, the orchids, are almost impossible. We really don't know how to recover a lot of small plants, the invertebrates. And you pay it back very slowly, and many of the species that would need it, like a regent honey, for example, this wants old, mature yellow box, Blakely's woodlands, grey box woodlands with mistletoe in. That takes, 50 to 100 years to recreate. They may not be around to even enjoy the offset that we made for them. I really hope they are, but they might not be. So there is very few solutions. We believe that people should do their own offsetting, so rather than paying into the government, because that's inefficient. The other thing, a lot of these big infrastructure organisations, let's say, Department of Transport in various states, they know what they're going to do for the next 20 years. I say, why don't you do advanced offsetting? You're going to push over a whole woodland in the next 10 or 20 years because you have plans for widening every road in the state. You buy the land, revegetate it, and then say, oh, look, we've done it. And this gets rid of some of the risks which are that it actually doesn't work. And look, the koalas are already back there. We planted these trees 12 years ago. There's koalas here. Trees are growing. The understory is recovering. And then I feel instead of borrowing from nature, we actually invest in nature and then we take it out after we've made it. The Biodiversity Bank should be a lending bank, not a borrowing bank. We should be investing in nature, not taking away, promising to pay back in the future.
And some of the things, even if we just talk about hollow-dependent species, we've now got, I've got to take my hat off to the Habitat Innovation guys with their range of hollows, that artificial hollows that are available now, and even denning products now. If you know that you're going to be destroying habitat 20, 30 years into the future, what you can start doing is banking those replacement hollows and be keeping businesses developing and putting them into the areas where you know you are going to take some of the hollows and build up populations before you start to reduce them. I don't know how the science would stack up against that, but there just seems to be a thousand things we could do planning ahead.
Definitely.
And that we don't do. Can I, before you go on, I wanted to ask you something about, this was put to me the other day about offsetting. It was a couple of weeks ago, actually. When an area is surveyed for offsetting and then down the track it's sort of reviewed about what has been retained or has come back, is it a species ranked on any kind of desirability, or is it just like we found X amount of birds, X amount of mammals, X amount of insects, X amount of plants, and then it's reviewed later and that we've got X amount of plants, X amount of birds?
Yeah.
Or
no, they have to create roughly the same habitat usually and recover the same species.
Okay,
So there are species-specific offsets. Yeah,
so
you can't trade
3 native species and then get starlings and spotted doves and common miners back.
Much of the offsetting is habitat structure, which does favour most native things, but it also can be very glossy black cockatoos, there's koala offsets, and you have to recover those. So, yeah, that's good. I might also add that the Biodiversity Council was instrumental in helping to make sure that the new nature repair market did not include offsetting. So the new nature repair market, which is ideally people are investing in nature so that they can run companies that are nature positive and biodiversity net positive. A lot of the science behind a lot of that is influenced from the Biodiversity Council and people like Martine Maron, Negan Evans, Sarah Beckersey, who are all global experts in the science of offsetting. In fact, much of the science of offsetting at a global scale comes from Australia.
Comes from Australia. That's right. So not only are we world leaders in eradication of species, we're world leaders in our knowledge on offsetting. I wanted to bring this point up before when we were talking about how governments are a bit blind to what needs to be done, and also in whitewashing any progress we have made. How is nobody in government talking about the Great Barrier Reef? I don't think there is any science out there that shows the Great Barrier Reef is doing well. How is the government going, nothing to see here? Tourism industry, don't worry, she'll be right, mate.
It is mysterious. This also gets to the point about how governments have often portrayed their reporting on state of the environment. So we've had state of environment reporting at a state and federal level for many years. Often you'll see in those reports, there's 2 parts. There's actually the state of the environment, and that's, we created the Certain Species Index that just shows biodiversity. Certain species are declining on average 4% a year, every year since 2000, which is terrible. 20 years, 4% decline every year after year. Amazing. If GDP went down 4% every year, I think people would be slightly upset. Or if our longevity went down 4% a year, every year, I think we'd all be a little bit upset that friend species are going down that fast. So that's the true state of the environment, the amount of vegetation in the environment, the amount of extant high quality habitat, they're all tracking down. What often governments do when they do state of environment reporting, they also report all the actions we're taking to stop things. So they'll say we're spending this money. So on the Great Barrier Reef, they have spent a lot of money. There's no doubt about it. Grabompa is a well-funded agency. They do a lot of research. They do a lot of on-ground work. There is investment in Queensland, the federal government, orders of hundreds of millions of dollars in habitat restoration, trying to reduce the rate of land clearing. Nowhere near as much as they should have, but there's efforts. Improved wetland management to keep nutrients out of the Great Barrier Reef and sediments out of the Great Barrier Reefs. They often say, I think state of environment is actually the state of the environment. And what we often get is we get the state of we're really trying very hard, we're not doing a very good job. So this is like the report card you got when you were 10, Grant, which said, Grant, I don't know, how were you at maths, Grant, or English?
Tries very hard, could benefit from shutting up a bit more.
Oh, okay.
That was
So,
basically my report.
that's good. So I think we do report cards, and there's the bit that says, how well did you do in the maths test? And then there's the bit that says, did you put in an effort? My view is it's the results that count, and it's good to put in an effort, and that shows we're trying. I'd say on the environment, the government talks about all the things they're doing, but the bottom line is, on a biodiversity perspective, it's pretty well across the board, almost all downhill. There are spectacular successes. Macquarie Island, I would say, spectacular success. There's individual recovery teams, the parrot team, some of the region punny, the staff. There's individual recovery teams who've had spectacular outcomes, often funded a little bit by the government, but we're only probably working hard on 200 of 2,000 of Australia's threatened species. So that's why we always know we're about tenfold behind the 8 ball.
And most of these on-ground efforts, when we're talking about planting the trees, let's talk about region honeyeater, without volunteers, none of that would happen. Without the volunteer groups, it just would not happen. Most of the surveying is done by volunteers, as I understand it.
We don't build a new AFL stadium or build inland rail with volunteers. Last time I looked, I don't know. No. So we always, basically every time the government spends money on the environment, they know the NGO sector, the philanthropy sector, and just people like you and me planting trees, doing bird surveys, their leverage is huge. They're getting 5 to 10-fold dollars of every dollar they put in because so much is done by volunteers. And then I puzzle, why are we only spending 0.1% of all our money on the environment when the people are willing to already multiply that by 4 or 5?
I've made this point in other forums before, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are on this. I think a lot of the money that we put out into grants that are supposed to be for particular outcomes are often really fudged, and we have a success metric for a lot of this stuff that is dodgy. And I will tell you, I was a land care coordinator and I used to write. So I know about staying up really late, weeks on end, writing grant applications, and you'd be successful and you'd get them. And then we'd go out and do whatever we had said we would do. But the success metrics, because we used to put what our own measure of success would be, and I always put my success metric was how many school visits I did and how many public talks I did and how many handouts I produced. I never, ever put a success metric in on the survival rate of the plants that we planted. So even though the purpose of the grant is to build shelter belts or connecting vegetation pathways, we got no idea how successful we were because we went on school visits and did handouts.
Yeah, which is an outcome from a Kingle perspective of raising awareness. But the federal government is I think, and NRM bodies are tightening up on outcomes. Outcome reporting is everything, but as you say, outcomes are highly uncertain. If you do a school visit, you do a school visit, tick. If you plant 1,000 trees, you could be really unlucky and 3/4 of them might die. And you may be planting them because you want to attract hooded robins, but you won't know for 20 years whether it works. So the bottom line is partly the project's always, as you well know, massively underfunded. We always nickel and dime our own selves. Most people in the environment movement aren't being paid proper salaries. And the evaluation, the reporting, the monitoring, the write-ups are never funded. So even in the bird world, how many bird watchers want to write reports and do statistical analysis? We could poll all the bird watchers you've ever spoke to, and how many people want to go bird watching? Count, yes. How many people want to record data? Everybody wants to go bird watching. We convince most people they should actually enter a bird data list or an eBird list. That's good, that's data. Who wants to then organise that information, do a whole heap of statistical analysis, fiddle with Excel spreadsheets, let alone write a report and then disseminate that report and communicate that, which is probably 3/4 of the job. The bird watching is the easy bit. So we often underfund that, and that's why what doesn't happen, let alone all the follow-up work. So we just don't fund these projects properly. We don't fund them like a business would fund them, like an infrastructure project would fund them. They have all these things, and all these things are properly costed.
You've obviously done a lot of bird surveys in your time, Hugh. I often think what could be implemented to make it easier for the new bird watcher, the new hobbyist, to use their experiences and what they're seeing to add to the body of data that is used by decision makers. Because if we've got 2 or 3 times as many bird watchers as we had 15 years ago, surely we should be able to be getting 2 or 3 times the amount of data. And I doubt that we are.
Yeah, it's hard to know. A lot of the growth in bird watching is photographers, and they provide valuable data, and also even now sound recording people, they're providing valuable data for automatic identification purposes, which is good.
It's so exciting, isn't it? How you can actually collect reliable data now without visiting a site more than twice. We can hang up the recorders and then pick them up.
Yeah. But still the bottleneck is the analysis and the writing up and the reporting. I think as BirdLife Vice President, I have to say I really love 20-minute 2-hectare counts. Just spent 8 days doing 150 of them. You really learn a lot because you're focused on that 2 hectares, the habitat in that 2 hectares. You're very focused on counting every individual bird in that 2 hectares, and you start to appreciate the relationships between bird and habitat. And that's what BirdLife Australia, the analysts there, of which we have too few again, mine that data to feed into the Threatened Species Index, which has had a big impact on government policy. So the Threatened Species Index, we put it in front of Graham Sanders before we did the review of the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation. The Threatened Species Index is now one of the single biodiversity indicator for Australia that the Federal Treasurer used to talk about the health of the nation. So there's health indexes, there's social indices, that biodiversity, percent species are in there. And that is a lot fueled by professionally collected data, but more and more it's being fueled by citizen science data. And really it's a matter of not only just doing lots of 20-minute 2-hectare counts, but doing them regularly and repeatedly. So I set up a bird survey in the Mount Lofty Ranges that the Nature Conservation Society now run. That's been going for 25 years, 165 sites, visited 3 times a year for 25 years. And that gives you an incredible picture. It's hard to track, as you would know, because of rainfall and weather and other things, what's going on with bird populations unless you've got more than 10 years of data. Keying into what hopefully BirdLife will roll out regional bird sites using their shared site method, so you can actually see the sites, and anybody could do them. You'll be able to get even better pictures of uncommon and common birds, particularly woodland birds across Australia. And then, of course, the shorebird people, I have to say, they're the masters of this. They've been doing a brilliant job 40 years, right? Their data is exemplary.
Yeah, shorebird and seabird people are the kings of bird ID too, or the regents of bird ID. I'm always amazed on seeing these dodgy photos that get put into some of the bird watching groups. I saw Rowan Clark had did something from this shocking photo on the bird watching Facebook group, and I just thought, superpowers. Fetid.
Definitely. Yeah, and seabirds are not at all like never go on seabird trips, and shorebirds I struggle with, but because I do everything by ear or custom, I get into none of those birds making a lot of noise. But their ability to pick up subtle changes in movement and morphology are unparalleled, really.
Yeah, fine. I always like to think that it's practice makes perfect. If you keep doing it, you can eventually get that good.
Yeah. People often ask me, I do a lot of public bird walks, how do you know so many bird calls? I go bird watching.
That's right. Yeah. And you just get out there, and if you don't know the call, you've got to find the bird making that call, ID it, and then you'll know that call. Amy has popped up here, I've been trying to inspire people to fill in eBird surveys. Is the data in eBird used by the Biodiversity Council?
It'll file through into bird data, and then it will file through to things like the spread Z species index, and it will get analysed. Yeah, so all of that, if it's in a centralised database, because the eBird data goes into bird data eventually, yes. I think there's this transitionary process. You start bird watching. When I first bird watched, I just wanted to see a new bird. I was 10. I want to see a black-chin honeyeater. And then I tick it off like this. Then my father, because he was an engineer, and he said, we should count everything. So we count everything and we do a full list. It wasn't just what we saw. And then you start setting up transects and being more rigorous. So the more people we can get doing eBird's good, you can, because there's no fixed time and no fixed route in most eBird lists, they can use time and distance to get some measure of bird abundance. Very important you count everything. But better still is the 20-minute 2 hectare counts and or going along to formalise wetland and seabird and shorebird surveys where they have a tighter method. So to get into the threatened species index, you really have to do the same thing in the same place in the same way. If it's 30-minute counts, a 30-minute count, covering the same area, with the same methods and machinery as such.
And how important is it here to do it at roughly the same time?
Time of day or time of year? I think it's pretty important.
To do it really regularly.
Yeah, I think generally the first 4 hours as a rule of thumb after dawn, maybe the hour or two before dusk is good birding time. Like this Bangham stuff we were doing middle of winter, the birds are actually pretty active all day. As soon as you get, in a place like Brisbane, I would say, by the time you're in the peak of summer, 3 hours into the day, most birds are very quiet. They're having a rest. It's too hot and it's too sticky. Same time of day, and ideally once every 3 months or once every month in a favourite birding spot.
So let's just tack back to the Biodiversity Council for a minute and tell me if you're under time pressure and you need to get away. But what is the 1 or 2 most urgent policy changes that the Biodiversity Council thinks either state or federal government need to take, like right now, like today?
Yeah. James and our council has been working very hard on this with the reforms of the Federal Government Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act laws. Basically, the laws aren't horrible, they just wisely don't get enacted. So 90% of land clearing in Australia is never referred to the federal government, even though it's affecting threatened species. So the law itself needs to be policed. And there's no point having a drink driving law if you never had a random breathalyzing test. Nobody would pay any attention whatsoever. So we need to police the laws we have. Every state also really needs to either work on tightening its land clearing laws or providing more incentives for landowners to retain their vegetation. So having spent my time in Queensland, where most of the land clearing in Australia is happening more at the moment and partly in New South Wales, a lot of that clearing is regrowth. So about 3/4 of land clearing in Queensland is clearing something a second, third or fourth time, but that's very rich habitat. Once that brigalow and those proper boxwood lands are up to 20 or 30 years old, landowners thinking, I better re-clear it. But if we could just provide carbon payments and biodiversity payments and incentives for those landowners to retain it, and they still want to graze underneath those trees, the benefits are enormous. And it also provides a lot of landowners with stewardship payments. I'm a big fan of governments getting back into helping people manage their land. Primary Industries, Department of Environment saying that these properties where you've taken out every single tree, the stock aren't happy, they're hot. You could actually improve your productivity and have biodiversity if you revegetated 20 or 30% of your property. You'd make more money. But they need some incentives and stewardship payments and mechanisms to get them over the hump, to get that natural infrastructure back into their property, riparian areas. I've talked to farmers who say if they can keep their cattle out of the streams and the dams by fencing off streams and dams and put water in a trough, they have a substantial increase in the productivity of those cattle and sheep because they're not walking around in dirty mud. They're just walking up to a trough. So these things, they cost money, right? But they make profit, and they're great for the environment if you get those streams and dams fenced off from stock.
There used to be land care grants available specifically for that. Was there just not enough of that?
Or I think not enough and not long enough. And we've moved away from extension officers, environment and from industry had a lot of extension. We've created the NRM bodies, the catchment management authorities, landscape boards, all those things, but they're not fully funded. They could have 5 times as much money and they still wouldn't be able to do enough. And they're probably the vehicle to deliver a lot of these services. People saying, I want to engage in restoring biodiversity. I want to start engaging in this new nature repair market or other sorts of incentive mechanisms to sell my beef at a higher profitability or still because I can prove that I'm stewarding biodiversity and carbon well, but they need help. A lot of these things, the carbon things and biodiversity things, they're highly technical. And also the rules always seem to change. So I just think more and more extension officers in the environment, primary industry space would be extremely valuable across every state in Australia. But I just see government departments cutting those people left, right and centre.
Yeah, and always the first thing to cut is someone involved in the environment and any feel-good kind of projects. You've been looking at evidence-based research in conservation for a long time. And we just talked about a handful of different methodologies to reduce habitat reduction in the country. What do you think would be the most effective way? What would be the first step? Would it be properly resourcing groups like catchment management groups, or would it be a direct payment to landowners? And I don't know how you then follow up through the taxation system that works actually get done. Because everyone's going to say, if we're going to spend $5 billion on the environment, we have to make sure it works. So if we were to get the government to say, all right, $5 million a year over the next 20 years, we're going to do it. What do you think?
We would all do.
Or how would you deliver it and then monitor its effectiveness?
Yeah, and I think more and more of the states and the federal government are trying to monitor the effectiveness. So, for example, the federal government, so a lot of their on-ground work now is feeding into the threatened species index as part of the granting process. That's a huge question. So I'd be designing a $5 billion a year program, which maybe I should not devise in 3 minutes. Should probably think more about it than 3 minutes. I would say some of the low-hanging fruit would be to, firstly, we had the existing high-quality delivery mechanisms, which is the NRM bodies, catchment management authorities, landscape boards. They could have more money. A lot of their investment is in soil and water, but if they had doubled their budget, and that doubling was for biodiversity, they could deliver along the ground because they're in the community and they're in the regions and they have trust of those communities to deliver. Recovery teams, we have over 2,000 threatened species, maybe 100 recovery teams are somewhat functional. We should have a recovery team for every species or groups of species, and they also need resources to do on-ground work. So a lot of it is large-scale landscape management because big landowners, of course, Indigenous Australians, I think, have a huge role. We're heading towards a country where 30 or 40% of the land will be managed by First Nations people. They have huge amounts of expertise, and I think resourcing Indigenous rangers, resourcing Indigenous landowners to steward their threatened species and ecosystems more would be great expenditure of money. So I would use the existing groups we have in the first billion or two before I started working out a new mechanism. I just think almost everything we do to the environment, whether it's First Nations environmental work, recovery teams, NRM bodies, they're all land care. They're all on the smell of an oily rag, just treating them like we treat the people who are building Cross River Rail in Brisbane. This is a $6 billion project for 3 train stations in the middle of Brisbane. So we do that, we do it properly, and it's going to work. and it's going to deliver a lot of outcomes. We don't nickel and dime across River Rail with a tunnel underneath the Brisbane River. You don't nickel and dime infrastructure.
Or stadiums. We
Well,
never
exactly.
nickel and dime a stadium.
We don't. Yeah.
No, it's weird that, Naomi, I'm going to get to your point in a minute because I want to follow up on that. But you made a really important point, I think, Hugh, that we probably need to push and probably talk to our own representatives about this. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've already got the people on the ground with the skills and the knowledge to be really effective. We don't need to design new systems. We don't need a great new body.
We just need to fund the systems we have properly.
That's right. We just need the people who can do the work to be able to fund doing the work and not do it on their Saturday and Sunday afternoons or be writing the reports at midnight after they've done their teaching load.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of things like you look at our threatened plants, which is more than half the threatened species list, a small community group, probably $10,000 a year, 10 years' time, they could save half the threatened plants in Australia for $100,000. Small community, they can't do it on $200. They can't do it on $500. They just need community-based, still very efficient. There's some sensors involved. There might be some herbivore managers. There might be some genetic work and some potting and some breeding and nursery work. But most Australian plants can be saved for $100,000 or $200,000.
Yeah. Now, Naomi has brought up something that I wanted to talk about. Naomi said she's a fan of the Artemis Foundation in Cape York, or it's the bottom end of Cape York, seems to be allowing a percentage of their land to regrow and be managed for the golden-shouldered parrots. Is that the kind of thing you're wanting other families or other farms, I think, to participate in?
Definitely. That's a shining example. I have never been there, but I've spoken to many people who have. That's so remarkable. I don't know how the system works in terms of the business model, but certainly there should be grants and rewards for those people, and there should be payments. So what is that, which is a spectacular recovery? It is, in a way, unusual that so much of a single threatened species is dominated in small number of properties, one place. So that's unusual. If you would go back to the old region honeyeaters or orange-bellied parrots, it's hard to achieve that because you're dealing with thousands of landowners over huge spaces. So yeah, they're the kind of things we really need to be doing. The other thing is not just stewardship payments, but maybe we could even have more rewards and prizes for people who've done the best thing in the past. Often we find in this space that people who are rewarded are the people who have made a mess of their property and now have to fix it up. But imagine those people who have, just because they've been very good stewards of the land and they love nature. I think there's a role also for a small amount of money to be just given out as prizes. Hey, you landowner, you now have 7 breeding pairs of region honeyeater for the last several years. That's amazing. Society should be rewarding you for keeping such a significant fraction of such a threatened bird.
Yeah, I've always thought that some kind of tax credit for primary producers and developers based on what you retain so that it can start 5 years after your development is complete and you get X amount of dollars for every species that existed on your initial survey that is still there or in the same number, rather than paying people to do hard landscape work. Because there's often money for equipment and landscape works and things like fences, but there isn't money for doing no harm.
Yeah. And being a good student.
Which is essentially what I mean with doing no harm. If you've got a lot of regrowth on your property, I don't know if I used to be an accountant in the country, tax accountant, and so many of the farmers that I spoke to would have operate maybe over a 10-year cycle where 7 or 6 years out of that time they might be profitable, and in the other years they were running at a loss. Wouldn't it be great if they were running profitably all the time based on not buggering stuff up anymore?
Yeah. And many countries in the European Union, many landowners are paid for the ecosystem services they provide. China, there's a whole heap of places where people are paid for providing clean water to downstream catchments. A lot of our catchments are grazed. It doesn't make any sense. But all those riparian systems around areas like where I am here in Brisbane, where drinking water over Lake Wivenhoe, most of the catchment is full of camels. That's ridiculous. The amount of sediment and poor water quality that's having to be treated is a win outcome if all those riparian systems were fenced. The dam doesn't fill up as much. The water quality is better. The treatment costs are lower, and actually society is much better off. More biodiversity, more carbon, more profitable agriculture, win outcomes, and you still can't get there, which is remarkable.
Is it difficulty perhaps convincing people to participate? I think it would be a small amount of farms that could help the Mallee emu wren, but now being a local of that area, I have noticed some pushback against greeny things. Yeah, I'll note here, Naomi lives in the foothills of the Blue Mountains, has purchased a property in the Mallee.
Oh, good.
And yeah, so she's got a special interest there. I guess the point really is there still that pushback in the agricultural community against greenies, and greenies wanting to stop. Greenies are always wanting me to stop me doing something.
Yeah.
Do you think that attitude is dissipating?
Well, it's definitely dissipating. It's definitely dissipating. And to be honest, whether we like it or not, landowners who can't, Europeans are talking about deforestation-free beef. So they are not going to be buying from states, countries and regions where there's deforestation after, I think it's going to be 2020 or 2025. Bottom line, we might end up having no market in Europe for our beef. And then what happens if the Americans and the Chinese, Walmart and all those organisations start doing the same? So it's in everybody's interest. That's right. Yeah, definitely. It's in everybody's interest to make sure that our environmental accounts are positive. More carbon, more biodiversity, higher quality water, because eventually we will lose access to markets at an enormous rate. Less use of pesticides and insecticides. So if this is going to happen, and if people aren't on board, they're going to lose market share. So those people who start restoring habitat for Mallee emu wrens, they're going to be part of this new nature repair market that Tina Pripasek has started. They're going to be able to get biodiversity certificates. I don't know whether they're going to be worth millions of dollars or millions of cents, but they're going to be able to get those certificates. And I think as the buyers demand nature positive and demand carbon neutral or carbon positive, they're going to profit from those activities.
We actually look at the amount of the earth available for agriculture, like in arable lands where there's enough water to facilitate the growth in the beef industry, because the beef industry wants to grow to feed the world beef, because of course more people all around the world want to eat the way we do in the wealthy West. But there isn't enough land and there's not enough water. Why do we even allow, this is what I don't understand. I don't understand how a government that has a body that's based on economic development and research, how do we even allow these conversations to start happening when they're absolutely not possible?
Well, the simplest way to allow people in other countries to get more access to our beef is to eat less ourselves. It is a fact that almost all Australians, a lot of Australians eat more meat than they should. You need about maybe 200 grams a week, not 2 kilograms. Many people are eating 10 times as much meat as they need, and to be honest, it has impacts on their health in a variety of ways. So my message at many of my talks is certainly for many people, it would be difficult to go vegetarian, and for some people who need iron at high levels, particularly women, it can be challenging to get your iron levels up with adding some red meat. But most Australians, vast majority of Australians could halve their meat intake, if not reduce it by 70%, and they would be happier, healthier people, and this we could send more to the rest of the world. And I need to go to another meeting in a second, Grant, so I'll give you one last shot.
Okay, one last shot. I just want you to tell me the best bird you've seen in your home patch in the last 4 months.
I'll tell you the best bird I've seen in my trips to the southeast, which is not really my home patch, but I'm there 2 months a year. And it was on the South Australian border side, I found a Fuscus honeyeater, which when I went to put it into eBird, it didn't exist. So that always makes me happy. I had to type it in and write all these comments. They do actually appear every year in the winter time into South Australia, and maybe a few. And this year, I think, was a big year for Fuscus honeyeaters in South Australia. So there's been 4 or 5 records, obscure, small. And this is maybe something you could ask all your listeners to answer in the next call. What does the word Fuscus mean? It comes from the Latin. What is Fuscus? And how can they weave the word Fuscus into their daily conversation?
Now, I looked it up when I was
good.
But I must admit, I'm not remembering. Now, Hugh, thanks so much for joining me again. I'm gonna take you up on that offer to talk about offsets.
Definitely.
In detail, if you
sounds good.
If you're willing, and I've tried to get Megan into a chat over the years. I'll see if we can get you both at the same time to talk about all of the issues of offsets.
Yeah, she's the real expert. I'm just a part-timer.
It's always great when
Thanks, Grant.
To speak to you. Thanks for
good to chat
on again. And folks, if you've got something else you want to talk about with me, I'll be sticking around for a little while. Hugh, drop out whenever you need to, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks, Grant. See you later.
See you.
Bye.
How cool is that? It's always great having Hugh on board. I'm pleased. That's the second time Hugh's been on. It's interesting the number of issues, and like I had James Tresize on when he was at the Invasive Species Council. We've done the Mallee Emu Wren. I'm just trying to think. I've got an episode about Artemis and Steve Murphy from the Artemis Foundation. Yeah, it's nice to see that I've been targeting. I feel good about having targeted the right people over the years for conversations. Now, I'm going to pop up this Biodiversity Council website again. You can find the Biodiversity Council at biodiversitycouncil.org.au. Now, what a really impressive group of people who have come together to try and make a difference. And the leaders, and then we'll have a look at the counsellors. We've got Honorary Professor, Associate Professor Peter Burnett. I've had Peter on the show. And then here's my whole wish list. Stephen Garnett, Richard Kingsford, Carolyn Hogg, David Lindemeyer, Sarah Lang, John Winarski, there's Ewan Ritchie. Let's see, who else? Leah Talbot, Rebecca Spindler. It's amazing. And then have a look at the board. I've got to say, who would I like to speak to there? I'd like to speak to Bradley Mogridge and John Thwaites for sure. And then the staff, James Tresize and Jana Dielenberg, fantastic. Emily Gregg. So many of these people are leaders in their field already. Look, I really hope that you found that useful. Here we are. LBJs can be referred to as Fuscus or AKA Little FJ. So Little Brown Jobs. Hello, Janice, by the way. Yeah, I think it just means a shade of brown, doesn't it? So let me check it out. Hold on. Get my Google. Fuscus meaning. Usage examples. Dark fuscus. Dusky brownish grey in colour. Yeah. They have it dim, dark, black, brown fuscus, meaning I've got, dusky brown. I just drab was always my thought. And I always thought it was not a really fair description. So, it's always nice to speak to Hugh. Oh, we're still going on the Instagram, I can see. Oh, Hugh's just jumped off, so there we are. Instagram folk, I will be ending, because usually Instagram's been going for a lot longer than the 1 hour. That's nice to see. Usually Instagram chops off after an hour. So that's nice, it's still going. Yeah, so there we are. Now, gang, I'm probably not going to be here tomorrow, but I probably will be here on Wednesday. And on Wednesday, I want to run through some of the interesting news items I have seen. Again, we'll be talking about what's happening in conservation. And we'll run through what's coming up, how I'm going to do the first seen and heard each week now. I think we'll get back into it starting on Wednesday and do a summary on a Sunday. Anything else you'd like to share, folks? Do you want to tell us the best bird that you've seen in the last little while? Highlights on your bird watching expeditions? Naomi, how's your hip? Give us the update. Are you able to be out and about on that? Oh, wow. Checking, I've had a few nice messages about Hugh being on the show. So, yeah, that was fun, wasn't it? Okay. Naomi's just telling us the hip is very painful. I have to rest it. Hopefully you over that very soon. I know I had a family member who had a dislocated hip, and it was a few days in the hospital before they could get home. It was difficult to get back in. Okay. There we are. Gee, 4 p.m. Can you believe it? All right, folks, I'm out. I look forward to catching you probably on Wednesday. And Naomi says, and she didn't see the yellow-throated scrub wren either. Naomi, you need to catch up and organise a trip out with Ricky in the Royal National Park, and I'm pretty sure you will see the yellow-throated scrub wren almost without a doubt. Yeah, so I'll see you on Wednesday and talk to you what's coming up this week. We've got habitat gardening again on Saturday morning as usual at 9:30 a.m. Next Monday, 6:30 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Biz Bell talking about island revegetation and eradication of predators and invasive species and some of the terrific successes that they have had in New Zealand and other places. And next week on Friday, 8 a.m., beg your pardon, we'll be talking about Tawaki, an update on the Fiordland crested penguin. Okay. Just checking, nothing more coming through. No. All right, folks, look forward to seeing you soon. I'm Grant. I'm a bird nerd and a plant nerd. See you later.